It was a crisp autumn morning, and the lobby of Crestwood National Bank was bustling with activity. Employees in sharp suits moved briskly behind polished counters while customers, some impatient, others simply passing time, waited in line. Among them was Christopher, an elderly black man with a weathered face and a kind smile. His neatly pressed suit was simple yet dignified, and he carried a briefcase that looked like it had seen years of use. Christopher walked with a deliberate pace, his cane tapping softly against the marble floors. As Christopher approached the counter, the room seemed to shift slightly. Two employees, Susan and Mark, both in their mid-30s, exchanged a glance. Their polished demeanor faltered just slightly, and a subtle frown crept onto Susan's face. "Can I help you?" Susan asked, her tone clipped as Christopher stepped forward. "Yes, young lady," Christopher replied with a polite smile. "I'd like some assistance with my account." Mark, who was standing nearby, leaned in and whispered something to Susan, barely audible to the other customers. "Another one of those time wasters," he muttered under his breath. Susan sighed loudly, her impatience visible as she eyed Christopher up and down. "Do you even have an account here?" she asked, her words dripping with condescension. Christopher remained calm, his smile unwavering. "Yes, ma'am. I've been a customer here for over 20 years. "Right," Susan replied skeptically. "Well, we'll need to see some ID." Christopher reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, handing over his identification with steady hands. Susan took it and squinted at it, her expression remaining dubious. "You sure this is your account?" Mark interjected, stepping closer. "We've had some incidents before." Christopher raised an eyebrow, but his voice remained calm. "I'm certain, young man. I've been banking here since before you started working." The subtle insult didn't sit well with Mark. He scoffed and muttered, "Some people think they can just walk in here and waste our time." Emboldened by Mark's attitude, Susan pushed the ID back across the counter. "Look, sir, we're very busy today. Maybe you should come back when you're more prepared." Christopher's expression remained composed, though a flicker of disappointment passed through his eyes. "I am prepared," he said softly. "I'd appreciate it if you could check my account." Instead of responding, Susan motioned to a security guard standing near the entrance. The guard, a burly man with a stern face, walked over, his presence adding an unnecessary layer of intimidation. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked, his voice firm. "No problem," Christopher said evenly. "I'm just trying to access my account." Susan leaned over and whispered something to the guard, who nodded curtly. "Sir, I think it's best if you leave for today," the guard said, gesturing toward the door. Christopher stood still for a moment, his grip tightening slightly on his cane. The room seemed to grow quieter as other customers took notice of the scene. Without raising his voice, Christopher replied, "Are you asking me to leave without resolving my business here?" "Yes," Susan said bluntly. "You're holding up the line." Christopher looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady but unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, he turned and began to walk toward the exit, his cane tapping softly once again. The door closed behind him, leaving the employees to resume their work, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. In the following weeks, the consequences of that day rippled through Crestwood National Bank in ways no one had anticipated. Christopher, as it turned out, was not just any customer. He was a retired financial executive with deep connections in the banking industry. When word of his mistreatment reached the bank's senior leadership, the response was swift and unequivocal. Susan and Mark were placed on immediate probation. More importantly, the bank's leadership implemented mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all employees. The training was designed to challenge biases, foster inclusivity, and ensure that no other customer was ever made to feel the way Christopher had that day. At first, both employees approached the sessions with reluctance and skepticism, seeing them as an unnecessary punishment. But Christopher, with his calm and steady demeanor, had anticipated this reaction. "I'm not punishing you," He had said the day he handed them their notices of mandatory participation. This is an opportunity, a chance for you to see the world through a lens you've been avoiding. It's not about shaming you. It's about expanding your mind and heart. The training sessions pushed participants out of their comfort zones, starting with storytelling sessions where people of different racial and cultural backgrounds shared their lived experiences. One afternoon, during a particularly powerful session, a young black woman named Danielle spoke about a time she was refused a home loan despite having impeccable credit. Her voice trembled as she recounted how the denial had crushed her dreams of owning her first home. It wasn't just about the loan, Danielle said. It was about being told, in so many words, that I wasn't good enough. That no matter how hard I worked, someone would always see me as less. Amanda, another employee in the session, found herself wiping away tears. She thought back to the way Christopher had been treated. Though she hadn't been involved that day, she recognized the same dismissive attitude in herself. For Mark, the moment of reckoning came during a role reversal exercise. He was paired with a black man named Harold, who played the role of a banker while Mark acted as the customer. Harold treated Mark with the same coldness and disdain that Mark had often shown to others, adding an air of condescension that hit Mark like a punch to the gut. "That's what it feels like," Harold said afterward. "That's what so many of us feel every day, like we're less than, just because of the color of our skin." Mark couldn't speak. For the first time, he felt the sting of prejudice, even if only in a simulated environment. It was a wake-up call he couldn't ignore. Over the next several weeks, Susan and Mark began to change, not just in how they viewed the world, but in how they saw themselves. They recognized their privilege, their blind spots, and the harm they had caused, both intentionally and unintentionally. The sessions were difficult and often uncomfortable, but they were also deeply transformative. Months later, Christopher returned to Crestwood National Bank. This time, when he walked through the doors, the atmosphere was different. Employees greeted him warmly, their smiles genuine. Susan and Mark approached him, their postures humble, their expressions earnest. "Mr. Reynolds," Susan began, her voice trembling, "we owe you an apology, not just for how we treated you that day, but for the attitudes and biases we've carried for so long. The training opened our eyes to things we didn't want to see about ourselves. We were wrong, so wrong, and we're so sorry." Christopher looked at them for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a small smile, he said, "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step, but the real work begins now. Change isn't about words, it's about actions. Show me, and yourselves, that you've learned from this." From that day forward, Crestwood National Bank became a different place, one where respect was not just an expectation but a foundational value. And Christopher? He never stopped believing in the power of change, proving that dignity, patience, and wisdom could move even the most stubborn hearts.